Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you, Amy. I never recognize myself. You know, when you look at the mirror in the morning, who you are. Well, I never recognize myself from those sorts of introductions. But what I picked up is in the world of the Philippines. One of the basic rules in the Philippines: if you can sing about it, and then talk. So I'm going to do three things. I'm going to start with a hymn that hopefully will capture a song to capture the story of what I'm going to talk about. Then a talk, which in a sense is speaking to a paper. Then we will have interaction, and we'll finish also again with a hymn. So hopefully all of this works. This is a song written by a friend of mine. It's a commentary on the book of Revelation, and it's chapter 7, verse 3.
Harm not the land, nor the sea, nor the trees, for the earth is the mother of all. And we who abuse her and poison her now, by abuse and by poison will fall. Harm not the land, nor the sea, nor the trees, or water precious and gold. And the sisters, the oceans will bring us new life, the warmth of the sun grows cold. The land, nor the sea, nor the trees, for the leaves of the forest bring rain. And our brothers, the trees, are the cradle of life. To destroy them will mock us like Cain. Harm not the land, nor the sea, nor the trees, though fortunes are there to be made. But a fortune is but if the soul of the land is the price that will have to be paid. Nor the trees, for they are not yours or mine. They belong to the children of children unborn, from now to the end of time.
So as I said, I'm talking to a paper that I've written on this, and Amy, thanks for reminding me of that. It's a very focused statement from the first Irishman from whom we have a written document, and that was St. Columbanus, or St. Columban, whichever you'd like to call him. And he's a lovely sermon on grace, and he puts it like this: Si vis scire creatorem, and in lovely Ciceronian Latin, creaturem. So if you want to know creation, learn about, or if you want to know the Creator, learn about creation. So as I said, basically, I came to the Philippines. My learning in this area was an experience in the Philippines in the 19th century. I became very much involved in the language, the culture. It was a time of enculturation, empowerment of people, the laity, particularly women, through very often these Sunday services. I was stationed in northwest Mindanao, very much involved with the poverty and the social injustice, but not at all awakened to the environmental degradation. My first kind of experience of that would be in this Pangal Bay in northwestern Mindanao, say after a monsoon. And you'd look out and the water would be chocolate brown. Now my concerns were very much for the farmers who may have lost their topsoil, not basically for the integrity of the forest or the integrity of creation, or the whole reality of the web of life. So I was very much focused. The document that Jim referred to, which we'll celebrate this October, the 40th anniversary of justice in the world, was very important for us, that working for justice is preaching the gospel, that there's no, in a sense, dichotomy between living out the gospel and working for justice. But I hadn't that sense of the well-being of other creation. It happened when I went to work among the Tiboli. They are a group of people, ethno-linguistically different from other people. They were never colonized either by the Spaniards or by the American period. In actual fact, if you wanted to do a PhD on them, your first reference in the literature is about 1915. So the literature review is very, very short. Why? Because they lived up in the tropical rainforest, 2,000 feet above sea level, and nobody had made their way up there until the 19-teens, and particularly until the 1950s, when they started to cut the forest. That was Lake Cebu, a wonderful place, 3 extraordinary lakes, 2,300 feet above sea level. Now, for the forest, I'd seen this in northwest Mindanao. The forest, for many people, was board feet of lumber. And what can I get from it? How can I sell it here, or can I export it? For the Tiboli, I began to realize the forest wasn't board feet of lumber, although they used forest products in their houses. They would, of course, they'd ask permission of the spirit of the tree before actually cutting down the tree, or even bamboo. But for them, it was also the source of their medicine. It was also the source of their poetry, music, dance, extraordinary music, and also of their religious traditions. So it was a wholly different concept of what forest meant. And of course, its destruction had a huge impact, not just on the landscape or on the topsoil, but also on their cultural psyche as well. I began to walk that journey a bit with them, but as a Westerner, there is no way I could ever get that level of intimacy that they have with their natural world. I remember beginning to campaign on some of these issues, and it was in the middle of the 1970s, early 80s, and many people who worked there at the time remember the anti-Marcos processes, so working for social justice, people who were detained, lack of human rights, people being killed. All of that was absorbing our energy. And for someone like myself to begin to articulate, well, we also have to look at what's happening to the landscape around us and to the difference of species, that was not being heard. It was being heard as, look, we get the political and economic things straightened out first. When that's over, we look at the ecological reality. One of the things I did in my last year in Lake Cebu is something extraordinary. I come from whatever people call the Green Isle, Ireland. Everyone says, beautiful Green Isle. Nonsense. Ireland is impoverished. There are only 12 species of trees which are indigenous to Ireland. They came back across after the last ice age. I got a lot of money from the Australian government for programs. In a single hectare of tropical rainforest, dipterocarp rainforest, you could get anything up to 130 species of trees in a single hectare. So that's the whole biological richness that has been and is being wiped out, with all kinds of destruction for us and for our future. And of course, we've seen now some of the effects of this ecological crisis that Jim talked about. The floods last year in the Philippines, of course, in Pakistan, those terrible floods in August last year. And the real problem in Pakistan is not floods, it's drought. And that's what's really going to make life very difficult. The sustainable development, many are familiar with the debate. It began in the early 1980s with Gro Brundtland. She was in charge of the Sustainable Development Commission on Environment and Development. They met for about 3 years between 1984 and then eventually, I think it was 1987, they published a book called Our Common Future. It was an attempt to look at economic development, but what are the implications for the web of life? There are many good things in it, but there are many things also that are not so good. Basically, in a nutshell, it was sustainable development means meeting the needs of this generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. As we'll probably hear from many of you afterwards, they were talking about levels of economic growth of 5 times what they are now. And of course, now we know you'd need about 3 extra planets to do that. And the astronomers tell us we don't have 3 extra planets anywhere near us. So I looked last year at the World Watch Institute here in Washington. They looked at environmental, looking at the sustainability, environment, social data, and also economic. And so they're trying to, the impact that consumerism is having on people on the planet. And they tried to look at how we could harness the media, business, government, traditions, social movements. I'm going to look towards the end of this how it might harness the insight and the energy which are part of religious traditions. And I think that's... So they basically talk about the great collision. There are now almost 7 billion people on the planet. They are making more and more demands on the materials of this world, the resources, the ecosystems, and at the same time, in making these items for them, we are dumping basically millions of tons of heat-trapping gases into the atmosphere. This is the conundrum that we face. So here are some of the figures. They give a staggering growth, 6-fold increase in growth between 1960 and 2008. Hyped, of course, by sophisticated advertising, by transnational corporations who control more and more and more of the fundamental economies of our planet. Increased consumption means consuming more of the Earth's resources, which means, in turn, using more fossil fuel, which involves, in turn, opening more coal mines, speculating for oil off the Amazon, now into the Arctic, building more factories, more roads, more railways. All of those, in a sense, to meet our consumer needs. Of course, the dark side of this, which we don't always see, is there's going to be more waste. There's going to be more expanding of agriculture into crucial ecosystems. We see this debate has been played out at the very moment in Brazil of expanding forests, the pressure from multinational groups involved in soya production, also involved in beef production, as against the integrity of the forest itself. These are the kind of increased consumption mean burning forests. We see this happening in Southeast Asia, Malaysia, and Indonesia. That wonderful dipterocarp forests, which I'm told by biologists have up to 5,000 different species of trees. So these are all being burned down to provide soya, or worse even, plantations of palm. Single monoculture, which do enormous damage to the soils eventually, and of course also to the creatures that depend on them, like orangutans, and also to the diversity of the tribal peoples who live there. These habitats are systematically destroyed to the impoverishment of the sphere of life, the biosphere. And then we enter into, which is very important in this whole pillar of looking at sustainability, and I only have 1 or 2 slides on this, but I wouldn't want it to minimize it, is that there is a fundamental justice equation here too. Because the amount of people, the number of people for whom this consumer economy has delivered affluence, like to all of us, is about 1.3 billion people. Until very recently, it was mainly North American, Europe, Australia, New Zealand. Now we're moving into middle classes in Brazil, China. 300 million moved in a period of 30 years from poverty to the middle classes, and India. So if, for example, every one of the 7 billion people on the world, living in the world, were to use resources in the way we use them, then of course everything would collapse at an extraordinary rate. So you have built into this concern for the destruction, you also have inequity. Why, to bring it back to my Tiboli, they have a right to eat at least twice a day as I do. So you could never forget the impoverishment that they had experienced as challenging any kind of ecological thing, saying, well, we want to keep people out of this equation. We can't. Since humankind appeared 2 billion, a million, I'm not going to get into Australopithecus and Homo erectus, whatever. But we always depend. We don't have chlorophyll in our ears. We don't fix the sun's energy directly. We have to get it through either creatures that do that have chlorophyll, like grasses, or creatures that eat grass. So we've always made demands on the natural world for our food, clothing, shelter, and everything else. As we did it for 100,000 years as tribal peoples after coming out of Africa, the second wave, probably 80,000 years ago, and moved right across the world, right down to Australia. So there was levels of consumption, but very often within the limits. So we shouldn't, in a sense, canonize. There is a theory that sees the movement of Homo sapiens, that's modern humans, when they moved here to the Americas and when they moved to Australia, that in a period of maybe 2,000 to 3,000 years, the megafauna actually became extinct. Has that a relationship with the humans coming in? That debate is still not there. But the only continent on which the megafauna survived is the continent where humankind emerged, which is Africa. So, of course, another huge change as civilization. Bigger groups of people, more structure, more organization, different kinds of usage of the resources of the earth, and structures about how to get them, to control them, religion, commerce, politics, you name it. But the exponential rate in consumption is the 20th century, no doubt, driven by advertising. Number two, a structure that was brought into manufacturing in the early part of the 20th century, planned obsolescence. And number three, this extraordinary search constantly on a finite planet for economic growth. We're briefly only going to look at them because we could be here literally. Was it 2 hours or 3? I always thought it was half an hour, but just shows you my sense of time. Advertising, huge. In 2008, global advertising reached, look, 643 billion. Imagine. Extraordinary. It's in all forms of media, promotes consumerism. Consume, consume, consume. It tells you in very different ways, as a man or a woman, that you're really someone, the more you consume of their particular, what they're offering you, whether it's food, clothing, perfume, you name it. And in this country, it's a link between Madison Avenue and the advertising industry in the early 20s, and then using all the insights of modern psychology, all that research to play with our expectations. Who do we think we are? How would we, in a sense, improve who we are? And yeah, buy, and buy. This is a statistic I thought, in the U.S., an individual here hears hundreds of advertisements every day, and I have been hearing those since they were born. So we're being bombarded from all sides. We think we're actually screening them out, but we're not. Until, say, 2 decades ago, 2.5, this consumerism was mainly Europe, North America, and Australia. But now, of course, it is not confined there. In the last 30 years, there's been spectacular growth in whatever you want to call them, the new economies, the emerging economies, or whatever. So consumer has taken right across the world, and now practiced by millions of people in Brazil, India, China, you could in South Africa, etc. It's like a tsunami, and it's heading to engulf the human culture and degrading the earth ecosystems. So that's the issue that we need to address. And in many ways, what happened in New York for the last 2 weeks was an effort to do that, and yet it didn't reach a good conclusion. The second one is planned obsolescence, basically, that things are made not to function well and only for a limited period of time. So they're made, you extract, you transform, you hand to the consumer, they use for a short period of time, and then they throw onto the rubbish heap. That's it's very much associated with Clifford Brooks Stephen in the 1950s. Corporations, a way to keep the manufacturing process going. If we made things that lasted, well, then people would be out of work. So no, we need this. We need to keep the cycle going all the time. It's identified, Sloanism highlights different aspects of the motoring reality. What would young people like? Speed. What would other people like? Well, we'd like style or whatever. Power in the engine. All of those, the famous slogan, a car for every person and for every purpose. And as I say, just recently, didn't launching the iPad 2, just a year after iPad 1, basically saying iPad 1, throw that into the rubbish heap. We can expect there'll be a new gizmo in 2012. Constant, accelerating consumerism. And of course, this is where it all ends. In rubbish heaps, which become in many situations toxic and are endanger human health and the health of the biosphere itself. Then the last one is, in this thing, is economic growth. It's a kind of a trinity of the consumer. Constant striving for economic growth. Everybody talks about it. And even in New York, we need now to have about 4% global annual growth in GDP or in GNP so that we can lift all these countries out of poverty, so that we would have money available for the various funds we need, etc., etc. That's now again. Jim did mention in the early part or the middle of the beginning of the 1970s, beginning to be an understanding that we can't continue to have expanding growth on a finite planet. The limits to growth, many of us remember that in the early 70s. Again, I discuss it in much greater detail in the paper. It was very insightful, but it was rubbished in many situations. No, new technology will take care of that. Miniaturization, you really don't need to worry. And it certainly didn't get the attention it deserved. It basically is talking about overshoot. Humans' activity with it, to live as we're living, and the capacity of the Earth and ecosystems, vital ecosystems, to meet our demands. And they're becoming less and less. And issues that we find extraordinarily difficult to deal with, like irreversible damage. Like if you wipe out the rainforest once in a place like Southeast Asia, say South Cotabato in the Philippines, it's gone. It's irreversibly gone. If you leave it long enough, there'll be no topsoil. I used to say to Filipinos, if you want to see what the Philippines will be like in 40 years from now, go to Haiti. If you want to see what it will be like in 100 years from now, go to Malta. There won't be any soil left to even begin to think of reforesting. So the main forces driving the dynamics of growth in a finite world. Of course, technology. Now, the reality is technology has brought extraordinary benefits to us. It has lengthened our lives, healthcare, education. It has presented us with tools that have made we don't have to have back-breaking labor and all of that. And many of us grew up on the myth, and that's in the technical sense, an understanding of progress, that we are on a conveyor belt. Things are getting better and better. You could say, well, your great-grandfather walked. His father got an ass or a horse. The next generation got a bicycle. The next generation got a motorcycle. The next generation got a car, and then we're all flying around. That's the kind of vision. And it's deeply, deeply rooted in the European and the North American psyche, and it's one of the most exportable things we have sent around the world, because it too is now driving a lot of the impulse in China and India. How to move from the current unsustainable framework of development to a sustainable way of living in the planet. The book, The Limits to Growth, called attention to the Earth was finite. It cannot sustain continuous depletion of resources. And so all the realities that are part of that interlocking, interrelationship biosphere, you take some of the strands out and you do irreversible damage. So this continuous spiraling demand, not possible in a finite world. We're only beginning to get that clear in our minds. Because the affluence of this country and the affluence of Europe was built on moving on. Go west, develop, maybe even exhaust, and then go west. That there was places to go west. Now we're finding out that there are none. 30 years afterwards, in the 1990s, they returned all of the researchers, except one. I think one of the ladies had died, to look at, again, these limits for growth. And now they had come up with ways of measuring the human footprint. How many planets would it take for us right now to be able to meet our particular needs? And according to this particular human ecological footprint, and again, I discuss it in more detail in the paper, we're probably now about 150% demand. So we're overshooting by 50%. Now, if you were down to your bank there in the morning and you asked him for money, and you were spending your money fast, you were running down your capital, he'd tell you after a while, your capital is being depleted. I hate using the term of ecological capital because it doesn't capture in any way the extraordinary reality. But that's actually what we're doing. We are running it down so that now it's future generations. They will have to pay for this in a much more impoverished and a much less fertile world. And a world that will actually impinge not just on their needs for food, clothing, and shelter, but as Thomas Berry used to say, on their internal life as well. Because without the wonder and glory of the planet, we wouldn't have developed the extraordinary imaginations that we have. The famous phrase, if you grew up on the moon, your imagination would be as barren as the moon. And I think there's good studies to prove that if you bring people to places where there's natural beauty, it actually evokes the best out of people. You have people in squalor and in degraded environments, and it does the opposite. And yet governments find this very hard to talk about. They're always, even last week, talking about we need more and more development, more and more growth. Remember here after 9/11, one of the first things your president said, go out and shop. This was a way to show that you were real concerned for what had happened. The same was true in the 2008, actually, near collapse of the global system, pouring trillions of dollars into stimulus. We need to get back to the levels of growth which we had 3 years ago. No sense that the levels of growth we had 3 years ago were doing enormous damage. And to get, one of the things that really surprised me, we get medical metaphors being used of the economy, healing the economy, when in actual fact, what's really happening with production and consumption is we're doing the very opposite. According to one of my friends, even though there are signs of recovery, global economy was still rather unhealthy. You need a couple of more percentages of growth. So you have this extraordinary reality of using metaphors about human well-being for something that's actually doing real damage. The economists had no understanding of the fact that this growth-oriented economy is plundering the natural world in an extensive way, now often in an irreversible way. He isn't aware of the irony of using a health metaphor about economic systems which are destroying the planet. So, and we're aware of the fact that governments, we can bail out banks. We can bail out financial institutions. But if something becomes extinct or an ecosystem is irreversibly damaged, throwing any money at it will have very little impact. And we saw that with the depletion of the herring areas off the coast of Nova Scotia. It was fished out in the 1960s and 70s. The hope was that it would come back. It has never come back, and possibly never will. So there's those sort of realities built in. If commercial lack of for example, overfishing of the bluefin tuna, which are down about 80% than what they were 40 years ago. If they go, that's it. Nothing will reconstruct them. We also know, of course, that economic growth is often, again, to go back to the argument, the human impoverishment and the justice argument. It's often at the expense of the poor of the world, pay the pittance for the kinds of consumer goods that they are churning out in their thousands to meet our kinds of needs. So again, I want to keep before us those three pillars. We're not just talking about ecological, protecting ecosystems. We're also talking about the impact of these kinds of behaviors on the poor of the world. Few economists are willing to look at the long-term effect of economic growth on the well-being of people or the planet. And that certainly was true last week. You could go into some of the other crucial areas. I have some of the PowerPoints there. Full one on peak oil. It's something that we're all aware of it. I'm not going to spend too much time at it. We're running out of these kinds of resources. Of course, if we weren't, and we were pumping carbon dioxide into the air as we have been, well, that is having an effect on climate systems and having a real issue that we need to deal with. It's not that peak oil in March of this year, it went through the $100. I think it fell back in the last few days, but that's not the reality. We know that actually oil is going to be a real issue. Now, there are a whole lot of other ways of dealing with it. From other sources of energy, other ways of getting it, it could become a very, very important and difficult debate. Fundamentally, we're the bell curve. We're in the The 20th century was the century of petroleum. The 21st century will be the century in which we'll see less and less of petroleum being used. And of course, we look at the countries, the new economies. China has doubled its use of oil in the last 10 years. A projection, 20 years now, it could use all the millions of barrels of oil which are produced for all the world today. So the economics of that, the arithmetic, aren't going to add up. They're attempting to secure oil from diverse sources, particularly in Africa. Of course, the West and Europe did it for 400 years, so we shouldn't be surprised that they'd like to do it too. Here's an area I think we need to look at too, the whole area of the growth of human population. In 1870, there was 1 billion people on the planet. There are now, let's say, 6.9. A lot of the growth is related to the use of petrochemicals in agriculture, the food available. In the process, we have degraded 40% of the lands of the world. So we're in a real problem here with this particular issue. The expected population is to grow to 9 billion, although I saw last week in New York a projection from the UN Office on Population Growth. They could see it going to 10 or 10.5 billion. The reality is it could be very, very messy, and it could be very, very difficult. The problem in Mary is, of course, it's the annual increase. I often say when the Spaniards left the Philippines, there was 6.8 million people. There's now 88, 89 million, and it's growing at 1.2, which means it doubles again in about 35 years. That's the issue. And that's, of course, the demand for food and other resources will double, putting extra pressure on already stressed and fragile ecosystems. I mean, the ecosystems of the Philippines that the Spaniards left do 70-75% of forest cover of the 4 different kinds of forests. Most of the coral reefs, for which people got protein in fish, were intact, as were the mangrove forests. They're in a very sorry state right now. I point that out. I wrote a book many years ago called The Greening of the Church. I talked about the Earth's carrying capacity at different levels. It wasn't addressed. The mechanism for addressing it wasn't there when Humana Vitae was written. So these measuring tools we talk about, human ecological footprint, are now available for bioregions and also for globally. So we need to revisit this question. And you see, you could get yourself involved in what you think is doing really good work. For example, in Lake Cebu, we had a woman there who was a St. Paul the Chart's sister, who helped bring down infant mortality from 40% right down to 10 or 11 or 12%. And you applaud that. Isn't it wonderful? And all the pain and suffering that has been avoided. But then when you see what it means in population growth, you're actually going to double the population in 18 years. Where are they going to go? To Manila? To the slums of Davao? To Ireland? You know. So we need to think through these issues. But of course, a fall in the number itself isn't what the issue is, because it is actually the levels of use to reduce the stress on the planet, unless this is accompanied by a drop in consumption patterns, particularly in the minority world. What I mean by that, I spent the last 2 weeks pulling my hair out with the UN documents, developing world. You know, well, I mean, the contradiction of that is you're saying to a group of countries, you need to become like us who are destroying the planet. So you know, you can talk about north and south, and then of course Australia is in the north and actually it's in the south. So I tend to use majority, minority as demographic terms, basically. The majority live. So at present, this is culturally one of the most crucial things of all. At present, most economic, political, and even religious thinking believes that all the space on the earth, in the seas, the skies, are meant exclusively for humans. We've got to change that perception if we're going to stop the biocide, which is happening right across the world. So other creatures, they have need of habitat, and unless we accept that, it doesn't mean that people cannot live with them, but what it does mean is we have, in the last 30 years, and projections in the next 50 years, we will be causing the 6th largest extinction of life since life began, comparable with the end of the Mesozoic period, when the dinosaurs were wiped out. That's the kind of equations we're talking about. And partly because we believe it's there for us alone. This is hubris, and I don't think the planet will not be able to sustain it. The role of technology, I'm not going to say too much on that. One of the arguments against the limits to growth was we're reducing everything, miniaturization. The computer, when they came out first, would fill this room. They're also, but of course, by the fact that they've got smaller, but there's more of them, and we get the same kind of. I was just, one of the big things they had, there's 5 billion tons of e-waste a year sent around the world. It was one of the figures they came out with last year. One of the things I see here is additive technology. It was on yesterday's New York or Washington Post. It's a technology where people can, well, what they're saying is possibly, for example, I'd like to have a violin, so I can go into a virtual website, pick out the violin I'd like, change it slightly for myself, and then press a button and print it, and the additive technology will print it. A lot of that could be extraordinary. It could return manufacturing to local areas or not. I just put it in there. I deal with it more in my text. But again, technology is not going to. One of the assumptions for the last 2 weeks in New York is some technologist is going to solve our problems. Technology will not solve our problems. One of the things they say about the additive, it would reduce waste hugely because you're only making one item at a time and you're not discarding all the other material. There's, for example, there's an example of it. Then you could have larger centers locally or whatever. This cradle-to-cradle design is much the same. It's been promoted by these 2 men to make sure. One of the big discussions last week is, of course, toxic chemicals and what we've done with them, and toxic substances that cannot actually be in contact with biological systems, and then, of course, destroying the biological nutrients of our world. Again, it's an effort to get away from this linear sort of technology, from mining through processing to short-time use, and then into the rubbish heap. It's to get all the Earth's technologies, they're all cycling. There's no waste. What is waste for one is actually food for another. This is one, of course, post-Fukushima. I think the nuclear question, we have to raise serious questions about it. The fact that Japan is not going to build its 17 extra by 2030, that Germany has said it will close down its reactors by 2021. Here's another area I think we really need to be serious about, the whole area of geoengineering the planet. Synthetic biology, nanotechnology, they have a lot of real issues that we need to be clear on, because the precautionary principle in biological realities must be much more serious. Because say the plane that brought me here yesterday fell out of the sky. I mean, maybe Amy or a few people would say, well, God, that's terrible. But you don't have to take all the planes out of the sky. But once you change something biologically and it reproduces, that's over. The guy who brought rabbits to Australia didn't mean to destroy Australia, but he did, because there was no predators there. Religion. What role has religion? It's very true at the moment. There's still only a very small percentage of people in the various religions that have taken seriously ecology. But it could become a major factor in forging a new culture of sustainability. Now, we shouldn't make too many claims for it at the moment. One of the men who has done an enormous amount of work is the Patriarch of Constantinople, Bartholomew II, particularly in those seminars he runs every year on waterways, right from the middle of the 1990s. The Pope, some of the ecological, at least to begin engaging some of those issues. The World Council of Churches talks about a pathway. The church's prophetic role to challenge the current status quo. That's essential. We have to have people who actually can take apart the current narrative. Because if they can't, then there's no way people are going to sign up to anything else. One of the best statements of it is by a statement given by Pope John Paul II on January 17, 2001, but got very little publicity. Modern society will find no solution to the ecological problem unless it takes seriously a look at its lifestyle. Sorry, that's the 1990 document. In many parts of the world, society is given to instant gratification and consumerism while remaining indifferent to the damage it caused. So he talks about simplicity, moderation, and discipline. And he goes on to call for a technological or an ecological conversion. Benedict has done something similar in some of his talks about the need to protect. We no longer do without real change of outlook, which will result in new lifestyles in which the quest for truth, beauty, and goodness and communion with others for the sake of the common good are factors which determine consumer choices and savings and investment. But of course, we need ourselves to get a narrative. If you're going to talk about that out of a theological perspective, you need to have that theological perspective. I think one of the great heresies of all modern religions is this, that more and more consumption is the pathway to happiness. And there's a focus for religious tradition to begin to, number two, accompany people in the painful process of changing from a non-sustainable lifestyle to a sustainable one. It's not going to be easy. In many ways, it will bring new gifts and new values to society, but in many ways, people are going to have to cut back. How can you do that? The church is positioned well for that because it's present at local levels, at regional levels, and at international levels. So we need to educate people in the religious tradition about the origin of the universe and the story that Jim talked about. And that's why in my own tradition, when I hear people, even from Pope Benedict, talking about this, but don't take seriously this new understanding of how our world emerged and our particular part in it, then you're not really listening. We have available to us this understanding about the emergence of the universe, our solar system, the formation of the planets, of Earth, the emergence of a proliferation of life. We have no idea, to a factor of 10, how many species live on the planet with us. None. If you go to Kew Garden in Britain, you'll see 1.8 million species. Some way have been described. Their properties have been enunciated by biologists, entomologists. There could be 30 million. It could be 100. We don't know. Because most of them live in tropical areas, and you have few enough biologists. Evolution of humankind in the past few million years. I mean, this story gives us a new understanding of what it means to be human, intimately connected with the 13.7 billion years which went into shaping the universe in such a way as it could support conscious life. That, in a sense, and my good friend John Feehan, have a book of his, he talks about his God's old diaries. If you want to find out what God was doing, well then, in the Carboniferous period, this is what he was doing. In the Silurian period, this is what he was doing. You don't have any interpretation. It's right there in the rocks and the vegetation. You have no bees or birds before the Cretaceous period. So you know how all of this thing... we'll be getting more and more and more knowledge from the natural world. We're part of the biosphere. We're challenged to live a way that doesn't undermine the well-being of the planet. Particular religious traditions can enhance this understanding of our connectedness with all creation. So I'm not saying there's not a place. All the religious traditions can, in a sense, position their understanding within this larger story that we are now privileged to have. And in our own tradition, the Judeo-Christian tradition, we believe that the creative principle behind all of that is best addressed in the personal terms of father and mother. So it's very personal, and it brings an extraordinary insight and closeness, connectedness, but within a larger context. Religions ought to highlight those segments of their scriptures or holy books which enhance the appreciation of nature, and do the opposite with what would do the opposite. I'm always saying that I fear at my funeral mass, which hopefully will be a few years hence, that someone will get up and say, of course, Sean did a great work for the environment, but now he's gone to his true home in heaven. Oh, they will. I have no doubt. I have no doubt. So we've got to get that straight. Are we earthlings? If we're not, are we just, Valley of Tears? There's a whole area of our theology which needs to be re-thought through. We are earthlings. And the future is as earthlings. I mean, that's what the resurrection of Christ is about. It's not that he rose as a spirit. The Greeks would have no problem with that. No, I mean, it's the resurrection of the body. So, challenge the elements that appear not to respect nature or are overly homocentric. And that's true of our ethics as well. Primarily on the focus on the impact of the current consumerism on the poor and on the planet itself. Traditionally, our aesthetical practices were divorced. Well, wear a hair short because you're giving glory to God. Now I think we can get a focus that we're asking people to live simply so that others can simply live on the planet. So you're connecting it to a reality. Now, the bishops of England and Wales and Ireland last week, they're going to reimpose meatless Fridays. Now, meat is a major issue in terms of its destruction on the planet. Now, all of us, presumably, here eat meat. Our evolutionary pathway was hugely facilitated by eating meat. But there's an issue here. Wouldn't it have been great if they'd connected that? Say, okay, maybe you should have 2 meatless days in the week because of where we find ourselves now and the need for a sustainable way of living. Religion must begin to highlight the moral dimension, how to relate to and treat the natural world. Very often, Christianity, we seem indifferent to the natural world. Religion, churches, we've upheld human rights. We've been quite good at that. Social justice, even people have given their lives and given their time and energy. But we seldom have been heard about what's happening to the plundering of the planet. And sometimes our anthropocentric ethics. If humans are the center of everything, and no other creature has any rights. Now, I'm not saying you need to approach this from a position of the moral or ethics of rights, but somehow or another, other species also have rights to be here on the planet. Churches have much to learn from traditional cultures, from other faiths, from different forms of Christianity, and I'd hope to end with one from the Celtic Christianity. We have much to learn about the intrinsic value of creation. In our tradition, creation wasn't intrinsically valued. It was instrumentally. It provided us with what we needed, food, clothing, and shelter. We've got to change that. We must finally provide a space for discerning and celebrating of hope. Because without hope, and without this discerning, this is not going to be achieved. We can do this with liturgies and worship. No better way. So our whole prayer life, both public and private, in a sense, should and could take on a new dimension, moving us away from this dualism that's at the heart of the European experience, for an integrating force, bringing together all aspects of ours. So here's the final point I made. I'd love to see a synod on creation. And it would be a wonderful synod, because the big thing about creation is it's always local. There are no generalized ecosystems. They're always local. They're Washington, D.C. So you could get people looking in local area for leadership, at national levels, and eventually, of course, at the international level. We give everyone a chance to share insight. A synod would be of great impetus to the task of caring for the earth that cares for every creature. Would give a new life and focus to the Catholic faith in our contemporary society. So, thank you.